Hello everyone, welcome back for more human physiology. So before we get started, I should mention that this set of lecture slides does not actually correspond to any one particular chapter in the book. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to cover in this set of slides and in these few lectures in this series cover things that are kind of spread throughout the book, and I don't really care much for that, so I like to kind of talk about all this stuff at once. So that's not to say that this information can't be found in the book, but I just wanted to let you know it's not found in any one particular chapter. So basically the topic of this set of videos in what we'll call this quote-unquote chapter is communication in the body. So we've talked before about homeostasis loops and how a lot of that's going to require the conveyance of information from place to place in the body. So we're going to get a lot of specific details on how those sorts of things happen in the body. So let's go ahead and get into it here. So like I just mentioned, a lot of our conversations on homeostasis were focused on this schematic that you see on the right hand of the screen here, this typical negative feedback loop that we use in a lot of our homeostasis mechanisms. So we start with a stimulus, whether it's the blood pressure is too high, your blood sugar is too low, etc., etc. The stimulus will be sensed by a sensor, and that sensor that detects the parameter being out of its normal range will send a message to the control center. Whether that's the brain or something else, that's going to depend. However, that message that is sent from the sensor to the control center, which we call an input signal, that message can come in several different forms. So that message, the input signal, allows the body to basically get the information that there is a problem. And then once the control center, in most cases that's going to be the brain, once the brain, in this case, recognizes that, okay, we've got a problem and this is how we're going to fix it, it has to send a message of its own. So it needs to communicate with the effector in saying, okay, this is how we're going to fix the problem. You're the person, you're the tissue, you're the cell that's going to fix this. This is how you're going to do it. So basically, there is a lot of cell-to-cell communication that has to go on here. The sensor is made up of cells. The control center is made up of cells, so we need cells to be able to communicate with cells. The effector is made up of cells, so when we get our output signal, that message has to go from cells to cells. So in a specific example, we may need the cells of the brain to send a message to the cells of the heart if we're talking about a blood pressure stimulus or an oxygen stimulus for exercise. So there's lots of different reasons why messages would need to be sent throughout the body. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, messages come in all different types of forms. So if we're talking about the real world, messages can be sent either over short distance or over long distance. So examples of short distance communication might be talking to someone who is in the same room with you, passing a note to someone who is in the same room with you. So short distance communication is limited by how close you are to the person that you are trying to communicate with. So the same applies for cells. So short distance communication in the body will require that the cell that is sending the message be located very close by to the cell that is receiving the message. So these types of short distance communications happen in a very few number of ways. Gap junctions, which we've mentioned before, a type of cell-to-cell junction, we talked about this in Chapter 4, allow for messages to be sent from the cytoplasm of one cell into the cytoplasm of its next door neighbor cell by having the actual messenger molecule move through the gap junction from one cell to the other. Contact-dependent signals we're not really going to talk about very much in this class, so let's just skip on over to these two types of signals that you see here. These are called autocrine and paracrine signals. Let's start with the paracrine signaling. So a paracrine signal will involve a signaling molecule, which is denoted by this little red diamond shape here. The signaling molecule is secreted by the cell that is sending the message, and then it travels through the interstitial fluid to a cell that is somewhat nearby. So you can see this cell here on the far right receives that message from the cell on the far left here, The little red diamond signaling molecule binds to a receptor protein on the cell that is going to receive the message. And we will have a lot more to say about receptor proteins later on. Now, autocrine signaling involves the same sort of principle, except this is going to only involve one cell, meaning the cell that sends the message and the cell that receives the message are one and the same. An autocrine signal will involve a cell secreting a signaling molecule, and then that molecule will bind to a receptor on the same cell. Usually the way I like to kind of present this to students is it would be kind of like you tying a string around your finger or writing yourself a reminder on your hand. It's a message that you are sending to yourself, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. So that covers short-distance communication, in which a signal or a message is sent from one cell to another over a very short distance. However, when we're talking about input and output signals in homeostasis loops, most of the time we're going to be talking about needing to signal over a very long distance. The cells of the brain are very, very, very far away from the cells of the heart, and so on and so forth. So we need different ways to send messages over very long distances, and there are two major ways that we can do this. The first that we're going to discuss is by using the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is going to involve specific chemical messenger molecules called hormones. So hormones are somewhat similar to autocrine and paracrine signals. They can be the exact same type of molecule. The difference is that a hormone is going to utilize the bloodstream to carry it throughout the body, whereas any paracrine and autocrine signals never left the interstitial fluid. There was no need for them to leave the interstitial fluid because they were traveling over a very short distance. However, by having an endocrine cell secrete its hormone into the blood, and because we understand the blood circulates throughout the body, we can achieve long-distance communication just by having the blood carry that messenger molecule, carry that hormone, kind of like writing a message on a piece of paper and then throwing it up into the wind. The wind will carry it a very long distance. So like I said, because we understand the blood circulates throughout the body, and because most cells in the body will have access to what is in the blood, this is going to be what makes the long-distance communication possible. Now, this is a point that I will definitely belabor as we go throughout this chapter, or this set of slides, and then also chapter 17 on the endocrine system. But something that I want you to take note of is represented here in this picture. So take a look at the far left here, this cell labeled endocrine cell. This is the cell that, again, is sending the message. It secretes a hormone into the blood. Now take a look at these two cells in the middle and on the far right. You see a cell that is labeled cell without receptor and a cell that is labeled cell with receptor. Now if we back up to paracrine and autocrine signaling, you will see that part of what makes the signaling possible is that the messenger molecule has to be able to bind to a receptor. Now, the receptor is what makes this all work. A receptor is what makes a cell capable of receiving a message. So if a cell does not have a receptor for a particular hormone or for a particular signaling molecule, it cannot possibly respond to that signaling molecule. So basically that cell would not be able to receive that message. So when an endocrine cell or an endocrine gland like the pancreas or the thyroid secretes a hormone into the blood, that hormone is not going to have effects on every cell in the body. It is only going to have effects on cells in the body that have the correct receptor for that particular hormone. So the cell here that is labeled target cell, cell with receptor, this is a cell that can respond to that hormone because it has a receptor protein that can bind to the hormone And when that hormone binds to the receptor, a lot of different things will happen inside the cell that we will talk about later that causes that cell to produce a response. That response is in some way going to involve a homeostasis loop. Now, most cells in the body will not have the receptor for that particular hormone, so the hormone will not bind, and that cell will produce no response. So, for instance, when your pancreas secretes insulin into the blood in response to high blood glucose, only very specific cells in the body will respond. Liver cells, fat cells, and skeletal muscle cells. Those cells respond because they have insulin receptors. Brain cells, heart cells, they do not respond because they do not have insulin receptors. So that is an extremely important point to make sure that you understand before we go any further. So other than the endocrine system, our other major method of achieving long-distance communication is by using the nervous system. So the idea here is that rather than using the blood to convey long-distance messages, so rather than having a hormone being carried long distances by using the blood, we are going to use nerves. So nerves are made up of big bundles of neurons, which are a type of cell that we talked about in Chapter 4, and these nerves are going to carry electrical messages over very long distances because a neuron's axon can be very long. So the longer the axon is, the longer the message can be sent. Say, an axon connects a cell in the brain to the cells that make up the heart. So we can send a message from the brain to the heart. However, there is some similarity here by using nervous system signaling to what we saw with both endocrine and autocrine and paracrine signaling. So even though we have an electrical message carrying a message over a very long distance, we are still eventually going to have a signaling molecule binding to a receptor on a target cell. That is something that is going to be common to every type of signaling method. So the idea here is that once the electrical signal reaches the end of the neuron is going to then release a type of chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is going to, again, be very similar to a hormone, to an autocrine signal, to a paracrine signal, in that this is a messenger molecule that will bind to a receptor on a target cell and should elicit some type of response, all for the sake of maintaining homeostasis. So nervous system signaling is something that we will talk much more heavily about once we get into chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15. So let's take a little bit of a break here and make sure that we understand, now that we've talked about both short distance and long distance communication, what do these things all have in common? They're going to seem very different, but we absolutely want to make sure that we understand what they all have in common. Now, all of these different types of signaling methods will involve the conveying of some type of message, whether it's a message that says our blood pressure is too high, or this is a message that goes to the heart saying you need to beat faster. All of these are going to involve some message being sent by a signaling molecule. So the signaling molecule, whether it's a hormone or a neurotransmitter or something else, might as well be a piece of paper that has a message written on it, right? So it's something that the target cell can receive and interpret and act on. The signaling molecule, again, whether it's a hormone or a neurotransmitter or something else, has to bind to a receptor protein on or in a target cell. Now, not every cell in the body is going to be a target cell. Actually, target cells are going to be very specific cells, usually. And then once the signaling molecule binds to the receptor, this is going to produce a response in the target cell. The response is going to be some change in cell function or cell physiology, usually by some type of change in protein mobilization. Whether we make a new type of protein, we change a protein's function, we'll have a chance to talk about those sorts of strategies later on. And like I said, the changes that we see in these proteins is in some form or fashion going to produce our desired response. So let me give you an example. There is a hormone that we will talk about a little bit in chapter 17, but much more heavily when we start talking about the urinary system. This hormone is called aldosterone. Aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands will only secrete aldosterone when your blood has a little too little sodium in it. So when you don't quite have enough sodium in your blood, basically aldosterone is going to instruct your kidneys to start preserving sodium so that we don't excrete a whole bunch of excess sodium out of the urine. So the way this works is that aldosterone will get into the kidneys and instruct those cells to start synthesizing sodium channels so that we can pull sodium out of the urine across membranes and get it back into the blood where it belongs. So that's an example of how a signaling molecule, in this case aldosterone, instructs cells, namely kidney cells that have receptors for that hormone, to produce a protein that produces our desired response. In this case, we want sodium getting back into the blood. So again, this is a point that I made earlier, but I want to make sure that we are absolutely clear about this because this might very well be the most critical concept in this whole video series here. Target cells versus non-target cells. And again, the endocrine pathway is the best example of this. So we understand by now that a hormone is a signaling molecule that travels through the blood. It is different than neurotransmitters, which do not travel through the blood, and it is different than paracrine signals, which again do not travel through the blood. Hormones travel through the blood. So the issue here is that since hormones travel through the blood, and because pretty much every cell in the body has access to the materials that are carried in the blood, why is it that only very specific cells can respond to certain hormones? And again, it is because only very specific cells in the body are going to have the receptor for that particular hormone. For aldosterone, only those cells in the kidneys have aldosterone receptors. For a hormone like insulin, only the cells of the liver and the fat and the skeletal muscle have insulin receptors. So because what produces your desired response is the insulin binding to the insulin receptor, cells that don't have that receptor cannot respond. It is so very important that we make sure and understand this. So most cells in the body lack insulin receptors, so those cells cannot respond. It's kind of like how you're capable of hearing things because you have ears. You're capable of seeing things because you have eyes. You're capable of holding things because you have hands. If a cell does not have a receptor, it cannot respond to a particular signal. Okay, so that is going to do it for this first video, so I thank you for your attention. Go ahead and join us next time, and we are going to start talking about more specifics of signaling molecules binding to receptors and their relationship. I will go ahead and sign off.